This coffee is oily, burnt, and it tastes like motor oil, and while that might be good enough for some chain cafes, if you clicked on this video, it's probably not how you like your coffee. By the end of this video, you'll know how to create profiles and roast coffee that tastes amazing, that you can share with your friends and show off your awesome roasting skills. This coffee comes from a local roaster here in Tokyo, and it costs around 1,200 yen for 200 grams, which is around $8. It's a good coffee from Brazil, competently roasted in Japan, but it's nothing too special. For something really special like this Costa Rican geisha I got from my friend at Hachino Coffee in Hokkaido, you're looking at more than 2,000 yen for 200 grams. Now, the roasters do add a lot of value. It's their job to understand the coffee beans and how to bring the best flavors out of them, but this does add a lot more expense to the beans for you. By roasting the coffee yourself, you can buy green beans much cheaper. I usually spend something more like 2,000 yen per kilo of green beans, as opposed to something like 2,000 yen for 200 grams from a specialty roaster. You also get to learn this new skill and build your coffee understanding and knowledge. So what do you need to get this 80% off the cost of your regular coffee habit? Of course, you're going to need some way to roast your coffee, whether it's a mesh skillet, a popcorn popper, or a standalone coffee roasting machine. I recommend getting a proper coffee roasting machine rather than something like a mesh skillet that you just roast over an open flame. It's just going to be a lot easier to get consistently good roasts, as with a skillet, you're not really in control of the roasting process at all. Now, it might seem expensive at first, but I paid for my roaster within a year of even light use by getting cheaper green beans. My first roaster was a Jenne Cafe roaster. It cost around $600, but with me drinking 10 to 15 coffees a week, I was saving more than $50 on coffee per month. That's savings of more than $600 a year, which basically pays for the roaster outright. There are different roasters available for different sizes, budgets, and needs. You can get the Fresh Roast SR800, which can do around 200 grams at a time, the Baymore 2000 AB, which can do around 400 to 450 grams at the same time, or you can get something like the Sandbox Smart Roaster, which I have right now, that can do only around 100 grams at a time, but has advanced programming for much better roasts. There are a whole bunch of roasters on the market and new ones being released all the time, so I'll leave links in the description below for home roasters at all budgets. The first thing you'll notice about any coffee is the roast level. How dark is the color of the coffee beans? From an almost yellow color to a deep black, the roast level is going to have a huge determining factor on how that coffee tastes. Lighter roasts will generally accent lighter flavors like fruity and floral notes, and darker roasts will have a lot more chocolatey and toasty flavors. But roasting is so much more than just the color of the coffee beans, and later on in this video, I'll explain how to understand a roast curve to get the most from your coffee. For now, let's talk about the most important factor going into your roast, and that is, of course, the green coffee beans. Obviously, your choice of green beans is super important. Many people don't actually know that coffee beans are actually a seed that grows within a coffee cherry, which is a fruit. Depending on where the beans come from, they could be grown at anywhere between 600 and 2,500 meters above sea level, and different growing and processing methods will have a huge impact on flavor. It's not uncommon for beans grown in specific ways to have natural flavors of cinnamon, mango, or pecan. I'll leave some links in the description to a few green bean providers in different places, but in general, finding good importers of green coffee beans is an incredibly difficult part of the process, and I recommend you look around for a good local importer. The first part of the selection process might be the country of origin, but bear in mind that different farms within the same country can have radically different flavors depending on a lot of things, including the processing method. The most common processing methods are natural and washed process. Natural process is where the coffee cherry is laid out in the sun, usually in a warmer, dry country where the coffee is produced. After a few weeks, the cherry will come off the coffee by itself when it's reached a certain moisture content. Washed process is, as the name implies, when the coffee cherry is washed off the beans and the beans are left out in the sun to dry without the cherry. These processes have a really big effect on how the coffee is going to taste, with natural processes tasting more fruity and earthy because they've been in contact with the cherry for longer, and with washed process tasting more clean and sharp. Two other processes that I've really enjoyed are honey process and carbonic maceration. Honey process is where the beans are depulped through a machine and then left out with the mucilage still on in the sun or in a greenhouse to naturally ferment for a few weeks until the bean reaches a certain moisture content. Depending on the conditions, you can get a really interesting middle ground between a natural process's fruitiness and the sharpness of a washed process. Carbonic maceration is where the beans are put into an airtight container with carbon dioxide pumped in to prevent oxidization. This leads to a kind of anaerobic fermentation that brings out some really unique flavors in coffee without the sort of mustiness that can come from other processing methods. For me, this is one of the most exciting processing methods, and I usually enjoy these beans a lot. When you're choosing your green beans, keep in mind the processing method, the country of origin, and the age if you can get that information. If you notice that the green beans you buy don't have a strong flavor or smell, it could be that they're not being properly stored by the importer. Order small amounts of coffee from new suppliers first. Don't make the mistake that I did of ordering a 5-kilo bag of coffee from a supplier I'd never worked with before. I learned most of what I'm going to share with you from years of roasting with different machines, and also from reading Scott Rao's books like The Coffee Companion and Coffee Roasting Best Practices. They're very, very useful books from an absolute master, highly recommended, and they improved my roasts a lot. Okay, so let's jump into the structure of a roast. A standard roast will look something like this. You have the start of the roast, which is called the drying phase, where the beans will lose a lot of their moisture. At between 4 and 8 minutes, depending on your roaster, you're going to start the browning phase, which is where the beans become sweet and aromatic. Once we reach the first crack, where you hear a popping sound, we start the so-called development phase, which is where the beans caramelize and add sweetness and body at the cost of high notes and aromatics. If you continue the roast much past that, you'll reach the second crack, where the structure of the bean really starts to degrade, and you end up with more toasty, smoky, and even burnt flavors that are characteristic of darker roasts. At the end of the development phase, you have the drop, where you remove the beans from the roaster and you start cooling them quickly, ideally within 4 minutes, to stop the transference of heat. The shape of this curve, whether it's long and thin or short and sharp, will completely change the taste of any coffee. There are also a lot of things that can go wrong depending on your choices as a roaster to raise or lower the heat or airflow, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the video. The first thing you need to do is heat up your machine to a good temperature to start at. Some machines like the Jene Cafe Roaster will start from 0, but this isn't good for roasting as it doesn't dry out the beans quickly enough and it'll slow down your roast too much, so you'll likely end up with baked and flat tasting beans. Depending on your roaster and batch size, you'll start your roast at least 170 degrees C, which is 340 Fahrenheit. This is called the charge temperature, which is the temperature at which you put the coffee beans into the machine and start roasting. The bigger the batch of coffee you're using, the higher the charge temperature should be. So for example, in my 100-gram Sandbox Smart Roaster, I start at between 170 to 190 degrees C, but for something bigger like the Ileo Bullet, which is a 1-kilo roaster, I might start somewhere between 180 and 200 degrees C. For a very large roaster at commercial scale, something like 10 to 20 kilos, it's safe to go up to 210 degrees C as there's a big enough mass of green beans to absorb the heat without burning the beans. You want to heat your roaster and idle at the temperature you intend to use for your charge for at least a few minutes before you put the beans in for consistent temperatures from batch to batch. This will be affected by the weather and the temperature of the day as well, so in the winter you might want to idle your roaster for a little bit longer as the beans will be cooler when they enter the roasting drum. Ideally, your machine will have a temperature probe inside and a way of tracking this on a graph. Without a roasting graph, it's pretty hard, though not impossible, to achieve a good roast and especially to replicate that roast. As soon as the beans go in, you'll see the temperature drop due to the cold beans going in and absorbing a lot of the heat. Usually at this stage, I keep the power of the roaster to around 50% until the turning point so that the heat doesn't go into the beans too quickly. Letting the beans come up to temperature in a more ambient environment avoids damaging the beans. The point at which the temperature stops dropping and starts going up is called the turning point. Once we hit the turning point at between 30 seconds and 1 minute of the roast starting, that's when I turn my heat up. Depending on the machine you have, the power grade will be different. For my small induction heat roaster, I turn the power up to 95%, but if you're using a gas roaster, 100% will probably be too much power and you'll end up burning or scalding the beans. Learn what your roaster can do and find the upper limit of how much temperature you can push without burning the beans. As you roast, the beans will turn from their natural greenish color to a yellow and eventually start browning at around 4 to 8 minutes into the roast. This enters the browning phase, where the moisture is low enough for Maillard reactions to start taking place and interesting flavors and aromatics start coming out of the beans. At this point, you'll begin to smell that sweet, gorgeous coffee roasting smell. This is one of the big joys of roasting your own coffee at home. The next thing you'll be looking, or rather listening for, is the first crack. This is where the pressure buildup of gases will break through the structure of the coffee beans, making a popping sound. This is where the so-called development time begins, though this is a bit of a misnomer as development occurs throughout the roasting process, but that's what they call it. The longer this goes on, the more caramelization occurs, so you'll get more sweetness, body, and richness, but at the cost of the bean's unique flavor. As your coffee gets darker, it will get more bitter and oily as the roasting process continues. Eventually, all coffees become pretty indistinguishable from one another if they get too dark. This is why you see those charcoal-looking filled hoppers at your local chain coffee place. They can get away with ultra-cheap coffee beans if they just burn the crap out of all of them, because they'll end up tasting the same. I recommend keeping your development time to between 15 and 25% of your total roasting time. Once the temperature has reached the desired level, you can drop the beans. This is called the drop temperature, and more than color, this is probably the best indicator of the final roast level. Now, all of this can happen in a short or long amount of time, which will give drastically different flavor results, which leads me on to coffee roasting speed. The speed of the roast is super important, and if you roast your batch really quickly, in general, this is going to emphasize the innate characteristics of the bean. If you're roasting for pour-over or to accent fruity or floral notes, you'll probably want to roast a little bit faster. This means using higher temperatures, especially early on in the roast, and dropping the beans earlier. Personally, I recommend never dropping the beans before the first crack. I'm sure people have done it before, but in my experience, you'll get an almost vegetable-like flavor from a bean that has zero development, and I don't personally want my coffee tasting like grass. Different kinds of roasters will operate at different speeds. For example, fluid bed roasters can heat coffee a lot more quickly than drum roasters without the drawbacks of transferring too much heat to the bean too quickly, which can result in scorching or tipping, which is where the beans or the edges of the beans get burnt. You can slow down the roast by lowering the initial temperature and the rate of rise, which will lead to more caramelization of the compounds in coffee that lend themselves to sweetness. This is usually a preferred way to roast for espresso, as it will limit the harsh flavors of a high pressure extraction of light roasted coffee. However, you do not want your roast curve to be too flat, or you'll end up with boring tasting coffee. So if you don't have enough time or coffee beans to do all of this experimenting yourself, how do you get the most out of your coffee beans without having to go and get a PhD in it? Here are a few of the best pieces of advice I got about my roasting. In his books about coffee roasting, Scott Rao talks about how a smoothly declining rate of rise is generally preferable for good coffee. The rate of rise, or ROR, is an indicator of how quickly the temperature is rising. You want a faster rate of rise in the beginning of the roast as you push through the drying phase, but you want to slow that down gradually as you enter the development phase to give the beans more time to caramelize without burning them. If you just power through your roast at 100% the whole way, you're likely to get burnt beans and you'll have craters appearing after the first crack. Craters are what happens when heat escapes from the bean too quickly and creates these small holes as they break through the structure of the beans, so you'll want to slow down your roast in advance of the first crack. This is why you need to gradually, step by step, lower the gas or power of your roaster as you enter the browning phase around 4 to 8 minutes in. I usually do this in small steps, as I want to keep the temperature increasing but slowing down as I enter the development phase. You have to do this carefully though, because you don't want the roast to stall or crash. Look at this roast curve here. That dip in temperature right after the first crack is a crash. It will probably make this roast taste less clear and exciting than without it. In this case, maybe the bean wasn't very dense and the heat coming from within the beans wasn't enough to continue heating each other. Stalling is where it takes too long to reach the first crack. You really, really don't want this. This means there isn't enough heat in the drum or coming from the beans endothermically to continue the roast, and it will end up with coffee that tastes unpleasant, even stale. It's not really possible to recover a roast that's stalled midway through, so you'll want to plan your roasts properly and get to know the beans that you're using. This is why a lot of professional roasters use a sample roaster to test the beans before they go ahead and put 10 kilos into one of their big roasters. This is more common with certain beans than others, so be sure to test them out and do a few different styles of roast and taste them side by side with a cupping to compare. I did another video on coffee cupping, which you can take a look at after you finish this video. Once you drop your coffee beans, you'll want to cool them as fast as possible. I have this cooler that came with my Sandbox Smart Roaster, and this does a really good job of removing chaff as well. Make sure you always clean your chaff out of your machine. It can become a fire hazard, especially if you're roasting back-to-back batches. You'll also need to leave your beans to degas or lose the CO2 from roasting for at least a few days before you store them, unless you have a coffee jar that allows air out but not back in again like I have. I'll link to a few different coffee containers in the description, but in general you've got standard coffee containers that don't let air back in. You've got containers like this one that remove the air and don't let air back in, but do allow the beans to degas. You've also got vacuum containers like this one that stop the coffee from aging and help it last a little bit longer. You should leave your beans for at least a week or so before you use them for brewing. I don't always take my own advice on this because sometimes I'm a little forgetful and I just start roasting as soon as I realize I'm running out. Using coffee for brewing only a few days after the roast is going to have a little bit of bitterness and smokiness from the roasting process. Now, if you're interested in making your own coffee blends at home, I recommend taking a look at this video I did about blending coffee beans. Feel free to ask me any questions or share experiences you've had with good or bad coffee in the comments. Roasting is a really tough skill. Don't get disheartened if you don't get perfect tasting coffee the first time. Just always be willing to learn more. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, you wonderfully overcaffeinated people, and I will see you on the next one.